Cool. Sego Skanagoa. That is Mohawk reading. That means I hope it is still the great peace with you, often shortened in our community to just Sego, which means still. And I hope it is the great peace with you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to share this event with my friend Alan Michelson, who I've known now for quite a while and continue to be one of his greatest fans, I think, in art. We both come to this engaged from our community perspective as Mohawks, but also people engaged in visual culture in general. And I wanted to talk about my own thoughts on the issues around landscape. Here, acknowledging that we are in the land, the traditional lands of Lenape and Mohican people, where we stand today. And I am a guest in those lands, as are most of us. And when we think of those places that make up this now called Hudson River, though it has other names in other indigenous languages like Ganonon, the Mohawk name for it, or Mohikenuk, which is the river that flows both ways in the version of Mohican. This landscape is both familiar to us and in a way can be estranged from us. Familiar in the beautiful images many of us are familiar with from the Hudson River School of Painting. And certainly how I first saw the Hudson as a kid growing up further upstate New York, in Western New York, far from the Hudson Valley. I knew it as this Edenic, landscape that I knew from painting. And I remember being very happy to see on an Amtrak trip to the city when I was a teenager in the fall that it is pretty Edenic still. And some of those same views can be recognized even today. But I'm also keenly aware in critical discourse, in a great way to my surprise, in art history courses that I've taught, of the critique against landscape, right? The critique that landscape as an artistic tradition in the United States is one that has prettified the displacement and erasure of the indigenous population, right? By supplying us terms that are deeply problematic, like wilderness, which implies there's no one there to displace. There is no wilderness. I remember when I was working years ago on a translation of the Gospel of Mark into Mohawk by a Mohawk speaker, in this case, Joseph Brant in the 18th century. The gospel starts out with a voice crying in the wilderness. Already, Brant is in trouble because we have no word for wilderness in the Mohawk language. What is the wilderness to us? Home, our place. There's just not a sense of that void area because we know that wilderness in English doesn't mean simply rural. We have a different word for that. But it means really a place outside of where humans live. And we didn't have that relationship to the environment, that it was outside of human life, right? And so even then he has to fudge in his translation and uses forest, a voice calling in the forest. Not the same thing conceptually, not at all in terms of biblical scholarship. But we also have this notion of wanting there to have been a pristine wilderness in North America, untouched. And that itself is a kind of fantasy. So this, if you know this part of this Manhattan project, it was digitally reconstructed through the National Geographic Society. Beautiful as this is and kind of alluring, it also still is erasing Native people. We have that one solitary smoke coming out of, this was a populated landscape, a landscape with paths and pathways, ways that we know made Broadway today, that ran the length of the island, that it was a busy place of indigenous trade and commerce between different nations. And so this notion of, if we could only go back to this time before contact, that we would find this almost Jurassic wilderness. That's not the native wilderness, right? That's not the native world. That's an imagined fantasy of a Lapsarian kind of landscape that just wouldn't have existed as long as there were human beings living on it. It's not to be mourned that it didn't exist, but simply it's inaccurate. That native people did intervene on the landscape. They did clear spaces for fields to grow things. They built weirs, they constructed dams, they did all sorts of things. And that was part of their interaction with the landscape. But in the sense that we have a beginning relationship with the Hudson River, called the North River, at first by the Dutch. And remember, these are oriented to the side, as older maps are. It's not for a long time that they get oriented north and south like we see them today. For a long time, it's always west to east. So there's the Hudson. This is Manhattan. There's the Hudson going up. And the Hudson would become most famously in art history because of people like Thomas Cole and his followers, right? A highly aestheticized world that included, in the case of Cole's career, and I'd say bookending his career, that's from 1826, and this is from 1847, right at the very end of his short life. Not easily seen here, but a native figure there, and a native figure there. And I was always kind of interested in these figures in Cole, because what are they doing in Cole's time? He would not have encountered native people that he recognized as native people living in the area when he did, right? This was a time of Indian removal policies. A lot of families had kind of gone underground or were keeping their heads down, if anything. But the sense that he's portraying really isn't about his time period. The use of that type of figure in any landscape, the art historical term for it is staffage, which I kind of like that term. You're like a staff member, staffage. And staffage is there for scale, right? And also in Cole's case, it has three reasons to be there: scale, location, right, and time period, I would argue. So location meaning, just in case, because he's an English immigrant playing on the picturesque tradition of landscape that he's brought with him from Europe. So without the native figure, not only would we lose scale, but we would lose geography, that he is in fact in North America, right? Because it could be the Rhine Valley, for all we know, or somewhere in Europe in the mountains. But once he puts a Native American figure in there, recognizable through having a feather on their head, basically. And time period, and this is where I would say I would argue, it's not necessarily true, but I think it's arguably the case for Cole that he is imagining that pre-contact time, the pristine version. We know, and I say this because we know also in his paintings, like the studies both of Catterskill Falls, where you have the tiny native figures, again, almost invisible on this. Here, right at the precipice, and here. Again, you have scale, you have placement, these always a prominent feather. But we know at this time at Catterskill Falls, there were buildings in place already. There was a viewing area, a wooden viewing area near the top for tourists already in 1826. He paints those out, right? They kind of, I think he's deliberately setting it back into what in his mind is something like Indian time, right? Before the intervention of things that were going on the river. And we know he bemoaned the building of any kind of mills or industrial complex down the river. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say he's an early ecologist. Some people have wanted to claim him for that. I think that's a bit of wishful thinking. I think he's more interested in the picturesque, and this is ruining his very beautiful landscape. You know, they're more like the poet William Blake's dark satanic mills in his poetry. That, you know, they're ugly. They're producing grime. They're not in keeping with this. And Cole's personally deeply religious felt sense of his Christian romanticism, you know, God's grandeur and so on. So I think time, place, and size are the main figure that native Staffage plays in his paintings, but not ethnography. What he is not particularly interested in or knowledgeable about at all are who lived there or lived still there, right? He's not aiming for any, they're always too tiny to be ethnographically specific in terms of what they're wearing or traditional outfits. Basically, he is using a good old stereotype by that point of a feather in the head, right? It's kind of like a cigar store Indian. And that will persist. If you ask a small child today with a stick figure, draw an Indian stick figure, it will just be a stick figure with a feather. It just, we can't escape it, whether we use them in such a way or not. A colleague of mine pointed out she was working on depictions in the 1890s of Diné, or Navajo people, and they were accurate depictions by someone living in that community and painting them, a settler painter. But when they were shown it in New York, one visiting critic, not knowing much about Native people, said, "How are they Indian? Where are their headdresses?" And when he was told, "They don't wear headdresses like you're thinking of Plains headdresses," he said, "No feather, no Indian." Right, so when you're reduced to one thing, when one, you know, kind of metonymic thing, the feather, becomes your identity, that is a powerful reduction in all sorts of aspects of agency, humanity, let alone something like sovereignty, right? So it's not to call Cole to task, as it were, and say, "You're no ethnographer." He's not trying to be. But also to be fully aware that I think they are kind of romantic at best representations, indifferent in terms of ethnography at worst, but they are part of that structure built into American landscape that has come under criticism. Because what are some of the criticisms besides erasure? One is that it is a kind of, seems like an invitation to take up the cause of manifest destiny. By portraying the land as bountiful but empty, seems to invite immigration, exploitation, settlement, right? And that landscape had that kind of commanding imperial view that you partook of as a spectator along with the artist, to gaze over something and think it's all empty and it's ours. And it's that part that people rightly are suspicious about, the innocence of landscape. You know, I don't think it's out there being diabolically genocidal, but at the same time, it is not innocent. It is not value free when it comes to its part that it played in the building of a sense of who had access to what in the Americas, who had the right. I'm also especially leery of Indians at sunset, right? We have been sunsetted for a very long time, you know, along with vanishing Indians. I always tell my students, the question I always ask is not why did the Indians vanish, it's who vanished them. Because vanishing is it's a terrible verb to describe our displacement and removal, because it plays innocent. It's the agency of vanishing is very unclear. Did Native people, did we do it as a trick? ta-da, we're gone. Or did someone do it to us, which the verb doesn't allow? So sunsets are similar. You always have these native people looking off into the sunset or at the edge of an ocean as though driven to the sea. I could have put in other examples here. There's one called The Last of Their Race by an American history painter who puts them, a group of native people, right at the edge of the Pacific at sunset. In the 1850s, there are still hundreds of thousands of independent native nations at that point. So what are you doing saying The Last of the Race in 1857? I call that aspirational vanishing. And it's very much part of a artistic tradition in the United States, right? Where we're kind of marooned in history to these little groups at the edge of the continent, being ready to be forced off into the darkness. Now, it's true that Indigenous people here don't have a painterly tradition of this representational type, but we certainly have concepts of representing nature in its most highly abstracted way. And one of my favorites is, of course, very familiar to Alan, the Gaswenta, or two-row wampum, which probably doesn't look much like a landscape to you, but in a way functions, more importantly, as a treaty and an ideal of how we are in the landscape as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So this belt is traced to one of our earliest treaties, the Mohawk people, with the Dutch on the Hudson. Remember, Fort Orange, now Albany, is the first Dutch settlement, not Manhattan. And Fort Orange, around the early teens of the 17th century, is a tiny little outpost, very, very far from the Netherlands in anything like military support. Talk about supply chain. We'll get you support in 3 months. It's coming. Hold on. They knew, the Dutch knew, that if it were to survive, it had to be with the okay and agreement of the Indigenous people around it, who had to find some benefit from it. What did we find beneficial from it? Trade, stuff we didn't make, manufacture, metal goods, guns, etc. And this treaty belt, the two-row wampum, is our treaty with them that says, imagine the white beads are the Hudson River. And imagine the two parallel purple lines are the wake of a native canoe and a European ship going down the river. And they leave this trail, this wake behind them as two parallel lines in the river. That's all good as long as those lines don't cross. Don't try to take over my canoe, and we won't try to take over your ship, right? And it said, it's not a fantasy of let's be totally untouchable. Elders also speak that we are only a handshake away from each other in those vessels, right? So that it is about cooperation. It's about shared resources, the river. There's no reason we both can't be on it. But don't try to take it, right? Don't try to command it. Don't try to overtake it and push us out, right? And so that notion of a parallelism in our existence within nature and its resources remains to this day an ideal among our community. You'll often see this as a flag in our community, the two-row, represented as a flag. And it means a recognition of mutual autonomy. I'm not trying to overtake you. You're not trying to overtake me. You are not the boss of me, etc. And that resource, in this case, the river. So I always say to my students, in a way, this is a kind of landscape, right? But a highly abstract one, which focuses on how humans use it, right? How we use it, meaning it is a shared space we both need. it is for transportation, it is for water, it is for food, right? The fish we get out of it, the plants dependent on it, our communities. No one nation should control it, as we shared it with the Mohican people and the Wapinger people and the Esopus people, etc. This has been the ideal of a kind of mutual response to the landscape. And I'll end my portion here today with just talking about a commemoration of this, where they tried to recreate in the river 2 rows. So we had paddlers paddle all the way down the Hudson they started in central New York, used the Mohawk River, and then at Albany go south down the Hudson and came to shore in the Hudson River in Manhattan. And of course, this was to commemorate a bond between us. No U.S. representatives or even city representatives showed up. The Dutch consul to New York showed up. So the consul from the Netherlands government showed up, and he honored our participation in this. And I was there. I didn't paddle. I think I flew down. But I was there, and I remember, people had this huge version of the 2-row on muslin, really long, that had to be carried by hundreds of people and was carried from the banks of the Hudson over to the United Nations, where speakers spoke. This was a tremendous opportunity, but it was, according to, local interest, non-existent. As far as we were concerned, the Dutch knew it was going on, we knew it was going on. And so, again, these are valuable insights from our culture that could be shared. I always think the 2-row is a very teachable object. It doesn't require a deep dive into Indigenous culture or Mohawk culture and tradition, but just an explication of its elegantly simple layout to understand, yeah, we love the landscape, we value it, and we have a profound ethos of sustainability that guides our culture. But this, to newcomers, is what we wanted to say about it. This is how we want to live. You can hear about other things like our 7 generations thinking, right? That you always think 7 generations ahead. It's just an act of imagining. And before an important decision is made in our communities, we think, will we be honored 7 generations in the future for our wisdom and the decision we're making right now? Or will we be damned as foolish, short-sighted, selfish? And that is an ethos of sustainability in and of itself, right? So I want us to think of those landscapes that were portrayed by people like Cole. Cole, at least uses the native staffage. I think of Church. To me, Frederick Church seemed much more the manifest destiny guy. There's no staffage in Church. But there is wide open, what he called epic landscape, because America lacked an epic like Greece and Rome, but we had the wilderness. I'm like, where are we in that as Indigenous people? Where are we in that view? But think of those kind of 2 notions of the way that certain artists are kind of deploying their vision of landscape here where we live, and the way Indigenous people want us to think about that landscape. Now I go, thank you very much.
So Scott was just talking about Thomas Cole's pupil, star pupil, Frederick Church. And this is a Frederick Church called Twilight in the Wilderness from 1860. And you can see it's quite a sky there. He was one of the lights of the Hudson River School, one of whose themes was light, and not just the aesthetics of light, but the poetics of light, the sort of allegorical, as Scott was referring to, associations with light. This next one is a photograph by a fellow I work with, Andre Costantini, who's a photographer and videographer. He's shot some works for me on the river. And this was a view he took of Haverstraw Bay when we were working on a project that I'll show you some images from a little bit later. But you can see that that the sky really does look like that sometimes. It's the Edenic view that Scott was talking about. A calmer view is this one by Sanford Gifford. It's a morning on the Hudson, Haverstraw Bay from 1866. And it's bathed in a different kind of light than Church's sort of sublime. One that is serene and sort of pearlescent. And it's populated with those cheerful sailboats plying their business on the bay. This is my sort of version of that whole sort of school. It's not as massive as this. It was a small framed video where it's called Twilight Indian Point from 2003. And I just shot the action on the river looking at in the direction of the Indian Point nuclear power plant. And it was actually a pretty serene scene. A couple of kayakers came out, and there's a bridge, a railroad bridge that sort of stretches across there. So I just followed it. It takes about a half an hour. Just followed it from dusk to dark when the lights start to come on the various, on the nuclear power plant and on this radio tower in New Jersey. And a night train goes by and so forth. So it's a kind of sublime, but it's this thing is an uncomfortable sort of element in the landscape because if anything goes wrong there, the landscape is gone. So there was a little sort of point there. And I also thought it was interesting that they called that spot Indian Point, because I think these were all Indian points. The next one is a late Thomas Cole. It's called Home in the Woods or Home in the Wilderness from 1847. And it's this painting depicting a settler family at their home in the woods. What it omits, and which Scott also referred to, is whose woods they've made their home, and from trees logged on site. You know, the sort of iconic American historical architecture is log cabins, which are actually constructed directly from the landscape. I made a work in 2012 for the Sydney Biennale that year called Prophetstown, which consisted of 8 paper scale architectural models of both historic and fictional log cabins of that architectural icon. And in my version of Cole's fictional cabin, I printed the notorious 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne, which conveyed some 3 million acres of native land to the United States through the coercion and manipulation of some chiefs in the Indiana Territory, what was then called the Indiana Territory, by its then governor, William Henry Harrison, who later became president. Bitterly opposed to this bogus treaty was the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh and his brother, who was known as the Prophet, both of whom founded a sort of almost like a refugee village called Prophetstown on the Wabash River, and fought militarily to preserve native land from the aggressive, brutal expansion policies of the United States at the time. That was also followed by the removal that Scott was mentioning. So the cabin has actually gone off on its own on a few exhibitions, and this one is an installation view in a show called Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which originated at the Princeton University Art Museum in 2019 and later went to the Crystal Bridges Museum, which is where you see it here, and you actually see it in relationship to its to Cole's version. And here you can see how quickly this territory was snapped up. The Treaty of Fort Wayne were these two big parcels here, over 3 million acres there. So imagine how many acres in total here. And these are, this is definitely against the will of the majority of the people who are out there. Like I said, this piece has sort of gotten around in various configurations. This is a scale model of the Cherokee Nation's printing house, also built out of logs. And I printed their newspaper, which was printed actually in that printing house, the Cherokee Phoenix, which is actually in their own syllabary, their own sort of alphabet, and also in English. And I printed the treaty that was that notorious treaty that allowed the state of Georgia and the United States to take over their land and led to the Trail of Tears. So this newspaper was in Cherokee and also in English. And it's all from one day in 1828 when they were on the verge of maybe having some success trying to hold on to their land. I think they lost the vote in Congress by 1 vote, something like that. So that earlier slide I showed of Andre's picture of Haverstraw Bay was this night outing we did, this idea I had to shoot sort of night video on the Hudson. And the way we did this is I found someone that kept their boat at Chattamuck Yacht Club here in Yonkers. And Chattamuck is actually another native name for the Hudson. And he actually had his father's police boat, which was an amazing boat that had a very strong marine searchlight. And my idea was to train this lozenge of light along the shoreline and just follow. I actually followed a passage that it was for a show that was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration of the river in 1609. And I chose a section where he had a violent encounter. His men had a violent encounter with the local people. There was some confusion about trade, and I guess his men thought that things were stolen instead of traded or something like that. And anyways, there was a skirmish, and I started at Hook Mountain. And so the beginning parts of it, it's about a half an hour, and it's got a beautiful soundtrack by White Mountain Apache composer and musician Laura Ortman. And it just goes by. It goes through places like, you can't really see it very well in this slide, but you'll see it in the next one, of High Tor, which was one of the motifs of the Hudson River School. And little known is that High Tor is like this sort of facade, really. It looks like a very picturesque still mountain, but it's actually, the back side of it is a trap rock quarry that's operating. So this is the quarry, maybe you've seen it, across the river. So this sort of sublime became this negative sublime. You can see that this is High Tor here, and the industrialization of this sublime. And Scott was talking about feathers and natives. Well, I made this screen, this large 11 by 14 screen out of white turkey feathers, and projected some panoramic landscape shoreline shots of all 3.5 miles of a very, very polluted urban creek called Newtown Creek, which is the divider between Queens and Brooklyn. And that's just a shot along the way. Didn't bring any video. This is just a video still. The thing lasts for, again, about, I think about 20 minutes. And here's another shot. You know, you just pass by these junkyards that are, the cranes are sort of moving, and there's something about the sublime. And it's actually looks quite painterly in a funny way, that what happens when you project onto a non-neutral surface is you get sorts of distortions, but you also get this marriage between a sort of materiality that maybe challenges the something about the video and comes up with something that's different. And this is a piece I did last year for Greater New York at PS1. You're looking at 30 feet by 7 feet by 2 feet of oyster shells, about 3 tons of oyster shells. I was fortunate to be able to install this in their double height galleries, so you could see it from 3 different levels. You could see it from the main level looking down, which is the sort of view you're seeing here, or you could also go down to the basement level where it was, and then there was a sub-basement level. Just you could go down a few more steps. And this is a closer up view. The closer you got to them, the more abstract they became, and the sort of more like colored, almost like colored liquid passing over them, because it was panoramic video shot from a boat, and you get some beautiful video quality. It's like a boat on a calm body of water is like the perfect dolly for something like that. So it's very dreamlike, you know, it just passes. And it's got a very vigorous soundtrack of Akwesasne Mohawk singers singing our stick dance, which was actually originally the Delaware or the Lenape skin dance. It was a set of songs and a dance that was entrusted to our people by the Lenape at a time of extreme social duress they were under.
How widespread are these indigenous languages in Akwesasne?
You know, I don't know, but I'm not quite finished with my lecture. Maybe if you could hold off till we, yeah. We'll just, I'm almost done. But anyways, I was thinking of their songs and their dance as coming from this land. So it's really the songs of the local landscape. So if you saw this piece, you would hear that. And I sometimes collaborate with organizations, and in this case, I collaborated with the Billion Oyster Project, which is a wonderful nonprofit on Governor's Island, who are recycling oyster shells from area restaurants and baling them and building oyster reefs in the harbor. And a single oyster can clean about 50 gallons of water a day. So their idea is to put 1 billion oysters back in the harbor to clean it. And this is their, I call the piece midden. You know, that's the sort of archaeologist's word for a big pile of shells. But you know, one of the reasons this area was so populated is that it was so rich. You know, it was like an estuary that had everything. You know, you could live quite easily in a way by gathering oysters, and there were many of these large oyster shell middens left by our people over the generations. In fact, a large one was found in 1998 when they were excavating for a condo in Dobbs Ferry. They found a very old one. It talks about it being a few thousand years old in here, but when they actually spent more time dating it, they think it's from 6950 BC. So that's almost 9,000 years ago. So that's there's no doubt, most of us think that we've always been here. There's always that toll-free land bridge, talk, but it's not clear exactly still where the origins are. But this is a huge, it's a sad thing in a way that this was, studied a bit and then bulldozed. There is a little section of it that you can still see, I guess, in the park there. And there were many of these dotting the landscape. And it's, evidence not only of our presence, but of a relationship to land that was reciprocal. We didn't exhaust the oyster population, which was quickly exhausted by settlers. Even in the 19th century, the original oysters that were in the harbor were gone. So they had to bring them from the Chesapeake. So it was already an oyster farm in the 19th century. So we're talking about this sort of attitude toward land and all the life on it being very exploitative, and they call it extractive now, extraction. This idea that you have no responsibility. If you own it, you can do whatever you want with it. You can destroy it, you can mine it to death. And of course that's in, it's contradistinct to what we feel ourselves to be in relation to not only the land and the water, but all the life on it, or all the life that it sustains. And I think we're now approaching a time where if something doesn't change, that it could become uninhabitable. We could be looking at an uninhabitable landscape, not just a far cry from the romantic landscapes that we've been looking at. Thank you.
Right. Well, I think a couple things. So Bierstadt, in that famous image you're talking about, where he has in the foreground kind of Native American community doing all sorts of things, he is sharply criticized for it in his lifetime by critics, right? That say you can do one or the other, but you cannot do both. If you want to be an Indian depictor and go Catlin's route, then do that. But don't make them these tiny little staffage figures and try to be accurate at the same time. You choose your venue, basically. It's a very odd criticism in a certain way. But he's very kind of wounded by that, and so he just, forever after, it's Wilderness 101, right? He does, very near the end of his career, in a kind of infamous painting called The Last of the Buffalo, show a native person on horseback with a lance about to kill a buffalo, even though what's odd about the title of the painting is there are hundreds and hundreds of buffalo in the painting in the background. So it's not the last, it's not even the next to the last, but it is at the period of US government, drive to make the buffalo extinct because they're the major food source of indigenous people of the plains. So we go from having 500 million buffalo to 500 buffalo in a shocking amount of time, right? And that's U.S. government policy aimed to crush Native people. So Bierstadt calling it, the late Peter Hasrick has an excellent essay saying that what Bierstadt's really looking at, the Native character, is the only solitary figure in that who is the last of, one of that tradition of the vanishing race, et cetera, et cetera. But it is part of Bierstadt. One early Bierstadt that doesn't get seen much, where he's actually depicts the Hudson, and he does have Native people, and because it's a completely imagined scene of Henry Hudson encountering, coming to land. You see the half moon in the distance, the ship, and then he's coming in a smaller boat to the shore of, incredulous Native people. And that's one of the few, but that's very early on in his career. But once he goes out west, he takes up that mantle of wilderness, empty, void, there for the taking type of thing. But it is because of this weird criticism he gets for depicting native.
Well, I was thinking also downstairs in Order, Reorder, and we have a wall of landscape, and we have the photograph by Jeremy Dennis. And then for the Ansel Adams, I chose, because I'm from Tennessee, I chose the Smoky Mountains. And I was reflecting a little bit upon, the national park system created all these wilderness reservations, and I had just never quite wrapped my brain so much around the concept that they were like preserving this empty nature that was also empty of Native Americans.
Right.
Suddenly it seemed very sinister, when that's not normally how we think about national parks.
Right, and if you look at the history of specific parks like Glacier National Park, there you have the forced removal of Blackfeet people from the park.
Yeah.
Right? So it is where they're living, and they're like, no, this has to be pristine wilderness, free of people who have lived here for millennia.
And that Yosemite
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. So these are parts of very, Alan was talking about the profoundly different relationship most indigenous communities have to land than settler extractive communities. And one way to see that is without universalizing among indigenous people, but a generalization that would hold pretty true in North America was that most of our communities and cultures have a custodial relationship to land, i.e. caretaking. And if you think, well, custodian, that's a humble word. It should be a thing based in humility. As opposed to proprietary, where everything is property and everything is based on profit. So, when I say an ethos of sustainability, we don't have a word for sustainability. And in fact, we didn't need it. Because the whole notion was that ethical relationship with the landscape is to take no more than you need. Well, that is absolutely against anything that capitalism would teach you. You take as much as you can get, you hold on to the extra, and you sell it at a high price when they don't have any themselves. Right? You think of, Adam Smith, scarcity, things like the way he thinks is so, there is the anti-indigenous way of thinking. Like if you're really not native, how would you think? Probably like Adam Smith. And that notion of having, this kind of arrogance towards the landscape, partly it's a long-standing tradition that comes from Judeo-Christianity. I mean, Genesis 1:28 tells you to have dominion over the land and every living thing, and that is not a native way to think about our relationship to our non-human kin or the places we live. That we have dominion over every living thing, the birds of the air, etc. It's ours to do with as we will. Now, there's a story of Rockefeller when he was on the Hudson building his place, blowing up some landscape to change his view. And they asked him, what do you think you're doing? He said, I'm doing what God would if he had the money. Ha ha ha, but I would prefer him to be struck with a lightning bolt right about then. Because that's not a good way to think, sir. and we've had corporations doing the same type of thing because they have the money. And so I think those real differences between custodial and proprietary are massive differences that show up in this stuff.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So the project that brought me back to New York in 1989 was a commission with a public art fund. And I was looking at, I think I mentioned this in the talk briefly, I was looking at the former Collect Pond, which was a deep freshwater spring-fed pond in lower Manhattan, sort of the area just below Canal Street. Canal was actually a stream once that led to the Hudson, and there was another outlet to the East River. And you had this, 60-acre pond complex with all the wetlands stuff around it. There was a huge shell midden on one of its shores. And it was a stinking mess. It was a complete destroyed pond by the late 1700s, and became a public, not only an eyesore, but a public health crisis. So it was killed, it was buried, and they built the first Tombs prison over that site, which started to sink because they filled it hastily, and they didn't clear out the vegetation, so that when the vegetation rotted, everything sank lower and so forth. And it was something that Dickens wrote about when he visited here, just how awful that site was, that prison was, the conditions in the prison, and it was also an execution ground. So about 50 people were hanged there. So you can't make this up. There's this thing that has existed since the glaciers, if the glaciers, all that, in terms of time, it's accurate, that couldn't last even 200 years from the time that Europeans got to these shores. And something went from this amazing, fount of life and life for all sorts of creatures, to this miserable prison and execution ground. I mean, to me, it speaks volumes of what we're talking about. And that's the sort of site looking that I've been doing for the last 30 odd years, is just looking at these sites and just like, yeah, really? This poor creek, like Newtown Creek, 17 million gallon oil spill there in the 50s. The first oil refineries were set up on that creek by Rockefeller.
Standard Oil.
Yeah, Standard Oil, and just after the Civil War. So it's not like, we don't, dislike technology and all the things that it takes to sort of produce that, but it's never been done in a smart way. It's always been done in a hasty, winner take all sort of way.
And short-sighted, no 7th-generation view. Right.
I think we are the 7th generation since the disaster of the American Revolution, especially for our people, because George Washington I made work about this too, George Washington sent Sullivan with 4 different armies to invade our homelands and chase us out, and it was pretty successful. Burned our cornfields, burned our successful farms and orchards to the ground. That's a little known part of American history. So we're the 7th generation after that, and look at the pickle we're in. Maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, please.
I'd just like to hear your thinking about the current proliferation of land acknowledgement by cultural institutions. I first heard it a few years ago at the Jacob Burns Film Festival. Prior to showing the films, they said a whole big thing of acknowledging the land they were on. And I thought, oh my God, that's like amazing that they're doing that. But now I'm hearing it all the time, everywhere, repeatedly, and I'm thinking,
right.
So what happens if they would now?
So it has that's excellent. It has a curious history. So because it certainly wasn't going on when I was a kid anywhere, right? It comes from Australia, and it comes from Indigenous people in Australia acknowledging each other's land on that continent when they visit. So you say, as a Marjub Jara man, I want to acknowledge that I'm in the territory of so-and-so, and I'm a guest here, and I will behave respectfully, etc. That's where it comes from. Then a university, and we should do that about the land we're on. And then some good, earnest Canadian heard it, and it jumped the Pacific to the west coast of Canada, and swiftly made its way to us in the United States and in the East. We've adapted it, so on. It's a nice gesture. It's simply a gesture. It does nothing, as one of my native students said at Syracuse, it's like someone calling you to tell you they stole your car. and acknowledging that they stole your car. And then you say, "Are you going to give it back?" And they're like, "Oh no, I do, but I do want to respectfully acknowledge that I stole your car."
This was your car.
Yeah, this was your car at one point. And so it has that kind of sense about it, like and it really is usually for the non-native people to feel good about the experience than us. I remember there's confusion about it too, and when the Syracuse decided, that it should have a land acknowledgement, an official one that the school would read. That's great, but I would be in my office and the Department of Physics or Chemistry would call and say, "Could you have one of your native students come over and do the land acknowledgement?" It's not a blessing. It's not, and it's not for us to acknowledge, right? I thought, you really don't get this, do you? And so I think it's a worthwhile question to keep asking. Yeah.
Well, I'm a retired teacher. When I taught fourth grade many years ago, having the topic about the Indians.
Right.
And the thing that I wanted to stress to the students, of course, I didn't have a very big knowledge myself about it, but what I definitely wanted to impart to them was this idea that the Native Americans, they used everything and they didn't waste. That every part of the buffalo, every part of the deer was used in a proper way and respectful way, and that they did not overuse it. If they needed, one deer, they didn't go slaughter 10 deers.
Exactly.
Whatever. And also, they had no concept of the different type of homes that different indigenous people had.
Right.
So I took them in 155th Street, Manhattan. That's where the original Indian Museum was. So we went over there, and they got really an eyeful of
Yeah.
it was marvelous exhibits there. So I think now that the teachers that are coming up now have to definitely stress what you've been mentioning about the land grab and all of this, because if they saw, TV programs about Indians, it was always the Redskins, and we're going to kill them, and they're savages and this and that. So I didn't touch that part at all. I wanted just to definitely make them understand of how they conserve the nature and didn't abuse it. And this is, the teacher has to have some responsibility to take a course and learn more herself or himself before they, forge ahead,
Right.
with this, because the idea was Kimosabe.
Yeah, no, I mean, these were dark times for where people learned what they learned from TV and movies, and that's not a good place. But it is precisely why some colleagues of mine and I put together that book, Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians, because it's aimed at teachers. It is aimed at teachers, and it goes chapter by chapter is a different period in U.S. history. So I did Indians during the Civil War, because no one ever talks about us during the Civil War. And of course it had a big impact on us, and some nations more than others. But that sense that the average age nationally that you stop learning about Native people in this country in public school is 4th grade. New York, you still get to revisit it in 7th grade, but that's rare among states. So you think, what do you learn in 4th grade? You don't learn the real hardships of, genocide, removal, involuntary sterilization of our women until 1978. You don't learn any of that. Yeah, you don't learn any of that. You learn nice settler stories about Pocahontas and Squanto and Sacagawea.
Right.
And so it seems fine and very definitely in the past. And until that's corrected, we're going to be in the same bind over and over about Native people.
Oh, and there's such backlash against the people who are trying to teach, the real history now. It's a scary moment.
Because it's not happy slappy.
Massachusetts, though, was there
Mhm.
recently, and they had in each of the museums that I went
Yeah, it's probably more recent too.
Yeah, things have changed a bit.
Sure.
Scott and Alan, you're both very, very informative, and I do have one question. One of my passions is boats and water, particularly protected waters like the Hudson, and not the ocean, but the Hudson and various rivers and lakes. And one of the things about an interest of mine over the years has been this notion of the warrior spirit among Native people, particularly the warrior spirit of the woodland people, the warrior spirit of the canoeists, the voyageurs of Kanawage, and of course it all comes down to the warrior spirit of high steel workers. But my question is really around the depiction of the notion of warrior spirit, especially among the maritime, you mentioned maritime, kind of, through the switch in my mind. I think is a fascinating thing as to where the positive reputation of Iroquoian people derived around canoeing in the water, the management of the water.
You know, when there were colonial wars here in the 1640s,
Right.
One of the first laws or restrictions they passed were to collect the canoes from the local people,
Right.
so they weren't allowed to move on the river.
Right.
And the rivers were the highways in those days.
Right.
So, but the fur trade, we were talking about sustainability, and we were talking about natives not taking too much. Well, we took too much then. We hunted out the beaver, and we hunted out other people's beaver, and we also then, we being the Haudenosaunee, we also were tough on some people in terms of competing for that trade, and we're imperial ourselves to a degree. So I think there's a sort of addictive quality about stuff, about the stuff that you trade for,
Right.
the sort of materialism that crept into our culture. But I think what Scott was saying before is that you had two very, and still do to some degree, have two very incompatible economic philosophies.
Yeah, no, I mean, the more, you're right, though, the more our nations got entangled with capitalism, with profit, with it, the more we became like the settlers. And so it was not our ethos before to overhunt anything. But if that meant the difference between buying guns and getting no guns, or having various products that we came to really want, and those differences happen quickly. I was thinking about even something like Haudenosaunee or Iroquois pottery. It stops at a really quick historic stop in the 17th century. It stops altogether with the introduction of copper-made vessels. It's as though they were a utilitarian thing that they just stopped making because they had something lighter, better, less breakable, portable. And it's things like that. Well, they weren't making them, so that meant they were dependent on them all of a sudden. They weren't making their own. They're getting them. And this entangles us deeper and deeper into this, this capitalist system.
Yeah, I think, the turn that the conversation took, I think was really what I was most interested in hearing about. We think about, yes, there's the idea of proprietorship versus custodianship. And then the whole concept of ownership, whether it's of land or of homes or of objects or even of territory. I'm just wondering, how deeply that was felt, and also, I mean, once you start trading for objects that you don't produce, then there ensues an imbalance, right? And it's sort of a covetousness, let's say, the haves and have-nots.
Right.
I'm just wondering in terms of societal structure, how deep that sense of lack of proprietorship was, how deeply ingrained that was, whether
I think it's remained a taught value of the longhouse for our people, and certainly in Handsome Lake's revival of the longhouse in the beginning of the 19th century prophet, that you do have calling us back to our original values, right? But it's true that there were senses of territory, right? That you are on Mohawk territory versus Oneida or Onondaga territory. But they're also shared resource areas, so that we know that the Abenaki and Haudenosaunee people both use the Adirondacks, right? And there's, again, one of these very early wampum belts, 1701, called the dish with one spoon. And that was the notion, again, of think of the Adirondacks as a giant dish that's filled with game and timber and fish. What it is not good for territorially is farming, right? It's all up and down, it's colder, but it is a very rich land for everything else. But no one group claimed exclusive use of it. And you could all use it as long as you weren't overusing it. Of course, we do fight with the Abenaki about it eventually, but that is in contradistinction to our original value system. That's when we're trying to make sure we're getting more English guns than they are, type of thing. We're getting more beaver belt, the beaver wars and things like this. And this is an aberration to the values of our traditional culture. Whereas things like the two-row wampum or the one dish, one spoon, that, because it said, everyone gets a turn at the spoon. And it's a spoon, not a knife or a fork, because it's not sharp. You're not going to hurt anyone with it, and so on. But those values get tipped on their heads eventually, too.
Alan, but either of you have any last parting words?
No.
I realize
We're good. We're good.
for a little bit longer than we anticipated.
Okay, we're
No,
good.
it's fine.
No.
For their questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. Thank you.